So in this section, we're going to talk about styling. First, we're going to review some of the most common practices for styling components, styling React. Then we're going to move forward into using one of these techniques. In this case, we're going to use one called functional CSS. We're going to make our app pretty and commit our changes so we can move on. But that's not all. We're also going to talk about our code styling. This is a very important topic, and it's one, at least for me, that I didn't consider important until I used it. We're going to talk about what is a linter, and we're also going to configure and see ESLint in action. We're also going to use another tool called Prettier that will make our code look nice automatically for us. At the end, we're going to wrap everything up into a git commit so we can execute these steps every time we commit a new change. So let's start. In this first video, we're going to talk about component styling, especially some different approaches in the industry to style components. Just as a side note, this is a very extensive topic and also a very discussed one. So this is going to be just a brief review through some of them, explaining some of the pros and cons that you will face if you use it. So let's start. Hey, if you remember from our last section, we ended up with a fully functional React application that fetches a recipe list from a remote API, loads it, and listens for a click event on the last item to show the detail on the right. The only difference is that I loaded some more recipes on the API, but it's the exact same code as we left it from our last section. But something's missing, right? I mean, at least it doesn't look good. And that's because our page doesn't have styles yet. So let's start by the most traditional solution, which is just using plain CSS. As I said, this is a very old school styling when pages were documents instead of apps. Basically, consists of defining just one CSS file that will have all our classes and global stylings and link it in our index HTML. Then we can use those class names in our React components to apply those styles to the different parts of the page. This solution has some problems though. First, it's very hard to maintain in large scale. I mean, that main.css file can scale to having many lines. Then we have a global naming problem, which consists of apply styles into one element without even knowing that we are doing it. This can be very hard to debug. As I said, we will have monolithic files and high coupling between components. That's why the industry started creating some other solutions. The other possible solution would be inline styling. That basically consists of making use of the style prop that React provides for the elements. The good part is that you will have your CSS in the same file as you have your JavaScript code. That's pretty handy for development. You don't need to be jumping from file to file to style some components. But it has some bad things. First is that you can't reuse CSS, or at least it would be quite difficult to do it. We will also have high coupling between markups and styles. This basically means that we have everything all together. This means that having your styles with your components can make your code quite robust. And also will make your components huge, because in this case we're just adding some red color. But imagine you need to add 8 or 10 different CSS properties. You will have at least 8 or 10 lines just for CSS on your component. That's not pretty neat. So here, some React specific solutions started to appear. The first one, and quite common one, is called CSS Modules. CSS Modules basically consists of treating your CSS files as a regular module inside Webpack. This means that you can import CSS files as you would import JavaScript files. When you import it, you get the styles as a regular JavaScript object that you can use for inject class names into your components, as you can see in the picture. The good part about this is that you will have isolated CSS per component. I mean, you will have a button.js and also a button.css file. So no more global namings or monolithic files, which is actually quite cool. The bad thing about this though is that you will have an incredibly huge amount of files. One CSS file per component. For a small project, this is not a problem, but believe me, you can have many components in your project, and this can potentially become a problem. Also, it's quite difficult to reuse CSS using this technique. It is quite common to use CSS modules with some other CSS preprocessor. I use Sass a lot in the past, but there are also many people using less. This basically means that you can make use of CSS modules, but instead of writing regular CSS code, you can write Sass or less code. And here is where things start getting interesting. Style components is one of the most popular tools for styling components nowadays, and it has many benefits. As you can see, it's a CSS in JS file, which means that uses exes backtrack syntax. Backtick syntax, if you don't know, is just another way of calling a function. The good part about styling components is that you will have your JS and CSS all together, as I just said. Also, it's very easy to define styles based on props, because CSS properties can now receive a function instead of a regular string. That function can take as a first argument the component props, so you can define CSS based on that props. Because of that, it's quite good for using animations. The bad part, although, is that you will have to deal with this odd syntax, at least at first. You get used to it, but if you're just beginning using React, you will find this way of calling functions quite strange. Also, it's quite hard to style components with too many nested elements. I mean, for the button we are seeing on the left, it's quite easy, right? I'm just defining a new button that has a color red. But if that button has a span or any other possible children, it's not that easy to define styles to that element. Finally, we have this other solution called functional CSS. The name can be quite confusing, at least it was for me. But functional CSS basically means having a CSS toolkit with extensible predefined classes. In this case, you can see that what I'm doing is importing bus CSS. It's not important to understand what is bus CSS right now. Just imagine bus CSS as a group of predefined classes, and you just make use of that classes inside your components. For example, in this case, the class name red is just setting the color to red. The good part is that you will have almost zero repetition, because every time you need to define something to red, you will just use the same class name. It enforces a style guide, because you can define what red means to your application and apply that for every element that has a class name red. Quick for prototype, and to use it, you will make use of post CSS and CSX next. However, the bad part about functional CSS is that it's quite hard to apply specific styles. In this case, if we need a darker red or a lighter red, we can apply that very easily. So you will find often using the inline styling in conjunction with functional CSS. Also, you can end up defining very large class names. In this case, it's just red, but imagine we also want to apply the padding, a background color, and a border. You will have one class for each specific property. But these are not all. I mean, there are many options out there. Here are some, but I'm sure if you look, you will find others. And I recommend you to take some time to research, try some, and choose the one that best suits for your project.